The Toronto Community Mobilization Network is made up of a diverse network of community organizations, NGOs, artists, labor unions, and concerned individuals from Toronto and the surrounding area that are joining together to oppose these undemocratic meetings of the G8 and G20 through protests, street action, street parties, and educational events. We are facilitating relationships between organizations and activists who will be protesting for self-determination for Indigenous peoples, climate justice, income equity, and community control over resources, migrant justice, and an end to war and occupation.
We're fighting the G8 and G20 this year as part of our campaign because it represents the richest people in the world and their governments, including Canada's, which keeps disabled people segregated socially, physically, and economically. Canada's government must pass accessibility legislation that means something now, which makes public infrastructure and buildings physically accessible to everyone, including transportation, which must also become economically accessible because the vast majority of disabled people live in poverty. Canada must stop denying entry and legal status to disabled people who are migrants on the grounds that they pose an excessive burden on our healthcare system. In Ontario, the government must lift the cap on direct funding for attendant care. Right now, the only way to access sufficient funding is to live imprisoned in an institution. Otherwise, people can't get the services they need. Canada must stop forced psychiatric treatment and forced institutionalization and imprisonment and incarceration of disabled people and people affected by ableism. Services and support should be available freely by choice, determined according to the people who need it and the people who use it. Finally, Canada must increase social assistance rates to stop legislating poor and disabled people to live in poverty, and must build accessible, affordable, decent housing so that people aren't pushed out of housing and onto the streets, homeless shelters, and prisons.
As marginalized bodies unable to take part fully and express our queer identities in the global political and economic world, we must denounce the systems of repression that manage our bodies, our mobility, and our relationships in particularly oppressive ways. Queer people, trans folk, people of color, Indigenous, and differently able people are exploited on a daily basis by the same dominant forces that exploit people's labors, the land, and the environment. And at the same time, we are unable to procure from the state equal rights and protection from discrimination. We will never be able to fully express our identities or build supportive communities while these global systems of power that enables rich, white, able-bodied heterosexual men to maintain their dominance over other groups of people continue unquestioned. We queers understand that while some of us live in oppressive situations, none of us will truly be free. Our liberation is bound together. From the advent of queer social movements, the politics of solidarity between people have been foundational. We will liberate ourselves by standing in solidarity with all who, like us, survive every day the power-mongering dictatorship of capitalism's war on the poor.
Next month, what is going to happen is that a collection of some of the most violent and dangerous people on the face of the planet are going to come to Toronto, where they're going to be provided with an armed camp out of which they can hold deliberations on how they can further their agenda of precisely making income more inequitable throughout the planet on an enormous scale. We have gone through a period of perhaps 30 years in which we were told that austerity, the reduction of deficits was the most important question. All of a sudden, as banks and financial institutions and corporations got into trouble, that was thrown out of the window and money was printed and credit was issued without any regard. Now, all of a sudden, we are back to the question of austerity. And how that is playing out is truly brutal. The local impacts of the agenda that they are fashioning are very clear. As a spin-off of that, let me say that poor and homeless people are already being targeted on the streets of Toronto. We are being told by homeless people that the cops are telling them that the G20 is coming and that we'll be watching. We're receiving reports of police officers in the downtown east going to stores with trespass letters that they want signed so that they will have the power to remove people that they deem removable when the time comes. And the deeper question is going to be the political agenda that is framed at that meeting. There is going to be, following it, a decade of austerity. We have already seen the special diet in this province gutted. We are seeing the impacts happening. We want to be part of the mobilisation. We want to build it locally, and we want to contribute to building a world in which the agenda of the G20 and everything it stands for is defeated.
Women in the global south and indeed all over the world will continue to die if funding for the full range of family planning and healthcare options does not include access to safe, legal abortion. Women's equality rights are being eroded under the Conservative government by ending the Court Challenges program, by cuts to Status of Women Canada and other women's advocacy and research groups, and by emboldened religious fundamentalists who have increasing influence in Ottawa. Women and trans people around the world want peace and an end to male violence of all kinds, from the violence in their homes, workplaces, and in public spaces, to the violence caused by war, occupation, and exploitation of all kinds. The interests of big business and banks are protected at the expense of social and economic supports worldwide. In Canada, money for tax breaks and bailouts means no money for pension protection, pay equity, adequate income supports, affordable housing, or childcare. These inequities impoverish women and trans people, particularly those who are young or old or who live with a disability. Indigenous women are disproportionately victimized around the world. In Canada, at least 580 Indigenous women have been reported missing and/or have been murdered over the last 30 years with absolutely no effective outcry or response from provincial and national leaders. Migrant women and their families are displaced by war, privatization, and climate disasters, and then are harassed, arrested, and deported by CBSA agents on Toronto streets, at their children's schools, at local malls, and even in services for women and children who have been abused. We will be engaging in a variety of creative feminist actions during the G8 G20 to highlight these and other issues. We will shout the fuck up, not shut the fuck up.
The G20 summit in Toronto will create checkpoints in the city. It will create borders that divide our city, and it will show the true face of global apartheid. The intense militarization that Toronto will face for a few days is a reality that millions live with every day of their lives. Every day, economic and military policies push people out of their homes, off their lands, and force them to migrate. Immigration policies and temporary work programs coordinated by the G8 and G20 globally have become the most effective tools of economic exploitation. Racist border controls treat migrants like disposable commodities to be used and abused by corporations for their labor. Wherever migrant workers appear, whether it's in the streets of Johannesburg or on the construction sites of Dubai or in the private homes in Tuscan, Vancouver, or Rome, we've seen the incredible growth of movements for migrant justice. The struggle will continue in June on the streets of Toronto. Every day in our city, immigrants and people of color live the daily effects of job loss and cuts to services. Every day in Toronto, migrants are denied access to essential services, healthcare, shelters, and other services. Live-in caregivers, farm workers, factory workers are made to live in daily fear that they could be detained or deported. In June, we refuse to sit idly by and let a handful of rich men in suits come to our city, take it over, and make decisions about the things that impact our lives. Our communities will be on the streets, we will shut them down, and we will show them our power.
I'm here because the urgent concerns of the communities that I just mentioned and that we are here representing and supporting will be excluded from the discussions that will take place behind the myriad walls, security zones, and checkpoints that will segregate G8 and G20 leaders, including our Prime Minister Stephen Harper, from ordinary people like ourselves and the communities that live, reside, work, and struggle in the city. For example, we know that the need for expanded and affordable housing for homeless people, working poor families in world-class cities like Toronto or other world-class cities that will be represented at the G20, that issue won't be discussed. We know that the fact that 11 million Canadian workers have no workplace pension and currently face a very uncertain future of poverty in their retirement, we know that that will not be a priority and will not be discussed at the summit. We know that the need to address deficits other than just on the back of workers, unionized or non-unionized, through freezing of wages, privatization of utilities, and private services will not be discussed. Our message to you, the media, and to the Canadian public is that you give space to these concerns and these questions, that you not only approach the G8 and G20 summit from a quote-unquote security perspective, but that you probe some of the questions and concerns that we're bringing up in this forum, and also to ask why is there a militarized zone and checkpoints in Toronto coming in June during the G8, G20 summit.